I'll be speaking to a paper that I'm co-authoring with my colleague Natalie Porter, which is the same title as the title that you see up here, and it's forthcoming in the Journal of Public Culture in spring 2015. So the paper brings together two controversies or kinds of case studies where sovereignty is invoked or leveraged by a range of actors over genomes and viruses. So some of the materials that data-intensive biology depends upon. And the paper investigates how viruses and genomes have become the subject of sovereign claims. Now, as many of you know, and as discussed earlier this morning, Indonesia's health minister declared ownership over H5N1 strains found in national territory and ceased forwarding virus samples to the WHO. And numerous countries followed suit, ultimately reorganizing international agreements founded on the global sharing of pathogens. Now, in biomedical genomics, countries such as Mexico have legislated a doctrine of what they call genomic sovereignty as a way to control samples and data that were collected from their national and regional populations. And so this idea of genomic sovereignty appears to be growing in its appeal, particularly in large-scale international collaborations where you have partners from the so-called global south and global north. So these declarations of sovereignty are certainly contested, but they've been interpreted as bold moves that reorganize relations of power in biomedical research, wherein countries can claim a room of one's own in the house that 21st Life Sciences has built. So to date, viral sovereignty and genomic sovereignty have really remained separate from one another, and so our intention in the paper is to bring these cases together to ask questions about the relationship between biodata and political economies of biomedicine in the global context. So in the paper we ask, under what conditions have viruses and genomes become sovereign substances, not just in the assertion of nation states, but also in the representation of continents, and how might these sovereign claims alter exchange relations in global biomedicine? So we're interested in how sovereign claims attempt to control, these increasing flexibilities of biological life, and how viral and genomic sovereignty as a kinds of terms upon which issues of ownership and control and authority might be deliberated in the coming years, and how these invite a rethinking of the kind of power of property as a driving force and conceptual frame for understanding developments in the life sciences. So of course viruses and genomes transect species bodies and territorial boundaries, and as they travel through research networks, they always manifest differently as natural, as human, as non-human, as informational resources. So these kinds of shifting material and epistemic properties make them certainly difficult to own in a straightforward manner or even to capitalize on. So in the paper, we argue that this kind of increasing appeal of sovereignty lies in its tethering potential. So as a process that kind of anchors biological samples to territories and geopolitical bodies. And in the paper, we outline sort of three aspects of this kind of tethering appeal. So first, sovereign claims tether biological materials to constructed origins by delineating forms of variation. So for example, the Mexican genome, the African genome, or an Indonesian viral strain. And second, sovereign claims disrupt imperatives to share biological materials and data by highlighting how essentially paradigms of openness and transparency really continue to disadvantage those with less authority in global biomedicine. And finally, sovereign claims attempt to tether biological resources in time, so kind of to harness their promissory potential as they move through research networks. So when Indonesia's health minister called for a more equitable distribution of global health resources, she based part of this claim on the Convention of Biological Diversity, which of course recognizes the sovereign rights of states over their natural resources. And prior to Indonesia's withholding of the virus samples, the CBD had not really been applied to viruses in Indonesia, in part because they were viewed more as a global threat, of course, rather than something like a state resource. And so although it was critics that sort of invented this term viral sovereignty to malign Indonesia's choice, the concept has provided a kind of critical framework for ensuing negotiations over benefit sharing and material transfer agreements. So now, although viral sovereignty was unprecedented in turning a kind of virus into a state resource, the attachment, of course, to national brands to molecular structures is certainly not new. So human genomes especially, despite the kind of rhetoric of their inalienability, are often articulated as state resources or national possessions. But in contrast to viral sovereignty, which was coined in opposition to the notion of virus ownership, genomic sovereignty has very much developed, particularly in Mexico, through a kind of explicit support of national control and national protection, particularly against the US and other European countries. So unlike the viruses of viral sovereignty, then, the virus has, its kind of status is that it's parasitic packets of DNA, and it hovers between life and non-life, and human and non-human. The kind of genomes that are sort of represented in genomic sovereignty are really kind of human in a sense, and kind of have humanistic orientation. And genomic sovereignty appears to be resonating with global health research programs that seek to redress imbalances in current genetic studies. So, for example, I know there's been discussion today that a lot of genome-wide association studies, which have been very popular over the last 5 or 7 years, mainly focus on European or Caucasian populations. And so projects, for example, like the Human Health and Heredity in Africa project or the H3 Africa project, build on this emphasis of supporting African researchers to study African populations and to provide African solutions. This is a kind of slogan of the project. And at a meeting in West Africa, senior US-based scientists referred to the most recent success of genomic sovereignty in Mexico and suggested that it might prove a kind of promising framework, essentially, for these global partnerships. So there's a sort of an increasing mobility of this term and its application from being nationally based to something that should apply to continents. Now, of course, viruses and genomes, as these scientists know themselves, are not confined to political boundaries, whether national or continental. So qualifiers such as an Indonesian virus or an African genome emerge through socio-technical processes. And making a case for sovereignty then requires asserting the value of this variation in virus and genome sequences. And that can be then tethered to specific territories and their corresponding populations. So this tethering effect in distributed systems of biological research could be drawn on to negotiate the terms by which these biological materials and information travel in these increasingly open transnational systems. So, of course, turning a kind of natural resource into a proprietary object requires technological or knowledge inputs or capacity building. And ownership requires, in a sense, adding value through, for example, the interpretation of data sequences. So one organizer of the H3 Africa project remarked to me, he said, "It's when you train people and you empower people who come from where the samples come from that you can truly have ownership. If that young man or young woman in Harvard or in Oxford is the one interpreting that data, they are truly the owners of that." So like viruses, continuity between genome sample and information is articulated through data interpretation, which here becomes a kind of prerequisite for genomic sovereignty, or what this person called true ownership. So both genomic and viral sovereignty certainly latch on to this promissory character of biological data and information. And rather relying on mechanisms of alienation, such as typical ones like intellectual property, discourses of sovereignty seem to tap into a kind of more primordial form of ownership. Claims of control then extend sort of from nature into the bodies of national subjects, and eventually into the modes of technological elicitation required to turn biological materials into objects of property. So in this way, genomic and viral sovereignty aim to transform existing systems of exchange, relations in the life sciences, arrangements that, while often espousing the value of sharing and openness, can nevertheless re-entrench inequalities, certainly between nations and continents. So just to quickly conclude that, I've sort of given a brief sketch, I know it's very brief, of the 3 themes that we look at in the paper relating to sovereignty. So the value of variation, the disruption of this imperative to share, and promissory potential. And then at the end of the paper, we turn to examine the future of sovereign substances and suggest that the spaces between viral and genomic sovereignty, as they relate kind of to the domains of security and to the domains of health, may in fact be closing. So for instance, during the publication of the Mexican genome, it was suggested that genetic variation may one day explain the high H1N1 influenza A mortality rate in Mexico. So unlike sovereign subjects of the past, viruses and genomes, as sources of information and data, are not necessarily here imbued with certain rights or interests that require protection. Rather, they're seen to contain a kind of latent value. And through this, we can see how data-intensive biology has occasioned a return to sovereignty then, not necessarily over persons or whole organisms or territories, but over these particle bits of biological life.